Blessed are you, O Lord, teach me your statutes.
The point is that God made an ordered universe. The universe itself is liturgical in fashion, in that it has certain rhythms, certain ways of moving, the solar cycle, the lunar cycle, everything about the universe is ordered and patterned. And we see that, of course, in the Genesis account, that before, the Lord moved, that the universe, he, of course, created everything ex nihilo, out of nothing, and then he, according to the Genesis account, the first narrative, began to assign purposes to it, and before that, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Father Farley makes the point that to the Hebrew mind, something doesn't truly exist until it serves a purpose. And so, which is to say, the purposes of God. And so, what we see in the Genesis account, according to Father Farley and others, is that God made an organized, liturgical, one might say, universe where everything serves a purpose and everything sort of works together, and there's a predictability to the way that it works. Again, solar cycles, lunar cycles, our own bodies are liturgical in the sense that it's not random, right? Our cardiovascular systems, our respiratory systems and neurological systems down to the cellular level, everything has a particular pattern, particular pulse, particular heartbeat. So, as we see in Scripture, God is not the author of confusion, right? Where God has put his hand, there is an order, a flow, and we would say a roi. So we don't really do random, right? And that's the first point to consider. So we organize time then according to the solar cycle, the lunar cycle, and in the way that we approach God in that sort of cosmic context, we reflect the createdness of the universe. One of the first challenges that we see in terms of just living as a human being and living as a prayerful Orthodox human being is that we have so curated the space around us that we're very much removed from the sort of cosmic, sort of rhythm of life. It's always some distance removed, and so we can artificially create, darkness where there ought to be light, and vice versa. So we are part of the context of creation that God has made, and we approach him with that context. And so we'll see that a little bit later on in the way that we appropriate prayer. So when you go back into the Genesis account, there's a verse that says that at this time men began to call out on the Lord. So we see throughout the creation account in the first few chapters a kind of an awakening where there's a realization that the Creator has made us and we have a responsibility to be in dialogue with this Creator. So we see then the unfolding, the evolution of worship throughout the course of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, in Greek and Pentateuch. And so we sort of see that there is an immersion of liturgical prayer from the very beginning. And this is a point that I make to people who come to us from, say, a Protestant church or the big box sort of civil religion. And I think, out of fairness, we need to make a distinction, that some of the big box churches aren't necessarily Protestant because they don't really hew to any particular classic Protestant dogma. They're sort of American civil religions with guitars and latte machine and the latte, So, not to be cheeky. So we understand when they come to us that we say, look, from the very beginning, liturgical worship has been the standard. So when you go back into the Torah, you're going to see, for instance, that the first, the Aaronic priesthood, from Aaron, that he wasn't self-generated. He received very specific instructions as to his role and how he was to achieve it. You see the emergence of the tribe of Levi as the tribe from which priests were sort of fashioned in that way. So there was an organization, and the organization follows all the way down. So the vestments that they wore were prescribed by God, how they were to be. The services that were conducted, the sacrifices that were made, how they were to be made, how the blood was to be collected, how it was to be poured. And so there's a very pronounced sort of liturgical regimentation in the way that we were instructed by God to worship Him. There's even in the Torah, there's a very detailed description of even how the incense was to be made that was used. And so in every aspect, the way that the temple was made, right? The size, the dimensions, the materials, its orientation, everything about it was written down by God so that one could not successfully advance the argument that worship of God has ever been anything other than liturgical. Right? I can give you an example. We have this idea that, no, we can be spontaneous. Just as a quick aside, because I think you'll find it fascinating. I was raised in sort of the Pentecostal tradition in the Protestant world, in a time and in a church that would have been proud to say of itself that it was the very antithesis of liturgy, and yet, even in the sort of, again, heavily curated chaos of a Sunday night worship service, like the same things kind of happen by the same people in the same pattern, the same way. So even in the midst of the chaos of Pentecostal sort of zaniness, there was still a liturgical sort of fashion in the way that people did. And I would regale you with some of the things that'd be hilarious, but I won't for the sake of time. Because we can't help but be liturgical. We can't live in a space of absolute spontaneity and chaos because we're not built for it. Right? So when you then look at the way that the church understands worship, again, understanding where that came from, it was the Christification of the worship of the temple and the synagogue. Again, so we didn't just make things up. I mean, look at the book of Acts and the phrase, and they were daily in the temple praising God. So we didn't just write this whole cloth. We were following a predetermined pattern from which with which we were very familiar because it was simply what we did. And then we see the immersion of that and the Christification of that. So for instance, in St. Paul's writings to the Corinthians, we see, you know, the beginning, sort of the words of institution, one might say, you know, quoting from what the Lord Jesus Christ said at the mystical supper, right? And so we see a formalization of that sort of pattern emerging, you know, of offering the body and blood of Christ in form of worship that would have been very familiar, you know, to the people who were worshiping in the temple and the synagogue. And so then people will say, you know, and you remember in catechism, guys, you know, that one of the first things we talked about was the historicity of the church. And the fact that, again, you don't make stuff up. So, you know, you move past the period of writing, you know, the New Testament, you know, the 9th decade of the 1st century with St. John, and you move instantly into the Didache, which is written, you know, just right after, you know, sort of the repose of St. John. And there it gives you, you know, the basic sort of shape of how Christians were worshiping liturgically at the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century. And then you can move forward into St. Justin Martyr, again, who's giving us a little more detail about the specific way that Christians were worshiping liturgically, and then St. Hippolytus of Rome and others and others. And so, again, there's no quibbling about the fact that Christians have always been a liturgical people. And the fact that some choose not to be today is really an historical aberration, very much out of keeping with the way that Christians have always worshipped. Right? And so we see then the way that we appropriate that is we assign prayers to certain times of the day. And again, looking back at the time of the temple, you know, the people on the temple looking towards the west. At the time that the sun slipped below the horizon, the trumpets would shout, and that began the new liturgical day. In the same way today, the first service that we do for each liturgical day is Vespers, a steady note. And that's the first prayer that we say at sunset where the new liturgical day begins. In a monastic setting, you would then do Vespers, and you would retire to the refectory, you'd have the evening meal, and you'd go back for compline. In Greek, apodipno, literally the after-dinner prayers. And then through the course of the night, you know, with nocturne, and then with the hours of prayer, and with matins, you know, and vigil if you do one, you know, we find a way that we sanctify, and this gets into the sacramentality of it, we sanctify the fabric of space-time by our prayers. And that's an important point to consider. When we're praying, we're doing something concrete to sanctify and to redeem and to rehabilitate space and time itself. Let me give you an example. People come to us, tour groups or festival or whatever, and they'll come into the cathedral for the very first time, and they have no idea who we are or what we're about, but not infrequently someone will come in and be instantly dissolved into tears. And they'll sit in the back of the pew, in the back, and they'll just sit there and sort of quietly offer these tears, because maybe for the first time in their life they're experiencing space that has been rendered sacred by the sacramentality that occurs there. So the word sacrament itself, of course, means to make sacred, from the Latin sacramentum. In Greek, you know, we talk about the mysteries, the holy mysteries, the Hagia Mysteria in Latin. sacramentum. But the idea with the prayers is that we're not talking to ourselves, but we are rendering sacred space and time and the material world and ourselves. Right? We are transformed, we are transfigured by those activities. And so we understand then, as an Orthodox people, the sacramentality of our lives, that the rhythm of our life, contextualized in that sort of cosmic pulse, if you will, through the liturgization of the world around us, is a step further made sacred. And so too are we. You know, again, the Greek word for saint is agios, literally to not be of this world, right? To be refashioned and remade in the image and the likeness of God to such an extent that we cease to identify with the world around us on its own terms, right? And then you move beyond that into the Eucharistic realm and the highest height, if you will, of our sacramental life. And it is indispensable. I had to apply a mild correction to the community here because we'd gotten into a bad habit of arriving whenever we feel like it, even though the canons of Ankara in 314 strictly forbid that. And we need to account for the fact that we are in all things guided by the canons, and we cannot expect to remain in a state of grace if we simply flout them. And so, you know, what that means for us is that, again, the canons of St. Beza would say that anyone who would voluntarily remove themselves from 3 consecutive Eucharistic offerings, and it doesn't say weekly offerings, it says offerings, have in that sense removed themselves from communion with the church as such. The standard of behavior and participation in the liturgical Eucharistic life of the church was, of course, very, very high. So the only category that we could understand for someone who comes to church and never partakes would be that of a penitent. But we don't have a way of understanding someone who comes to church and doesn't commune because, again, the canons, you know, really, really forbid that. And so we understand then, you know, that we are given the possibility of, through the invocation of the Holy Spirit, down upon us, because again, the prayer of the Ecclesia says, and make us first, and then these holy gifts, right? So we are changed, right? And then we partake of the body and blood of Christ, which again is the sacralization of matter itself. So everything in the church really exists, again, not just in a liturgical way, and let's talk about that because it's a very precise word. In a true liturgy, there are no passive observers. There aren't people who are watching. In a liturgy, there are participants. And we have a challenge in Orthodoxy today because we have a tendency to want to conflate like the musical aspect. And we want to say that should be treated as a thing apart. But beloved, I'm here to tell you, if we execute a perfectly done liturgy, performance, in a way that hews to, you know, some typically kind of made up historical idea, but do liturgy in a way that people cannot participate, then the question must be asked whether or not a real liturgy actually occurred. And I tell the people here, if we liturgize in a way that our children don't understand it and cannot participate, then we're simply doing it wrong. Right? So we have to understand that if it is really the ergon or the litos, if it is really that common activity, we talk about that in the third prayer of the antiphon, you know, with Greek words like, you know, sin liturgundon, sin dixologundon, you know, so that we're worshiping together with, we're giving glory together with, in this case, the angels. Then the paradigm really is one of absolute maximum participation. And I could tell you stories, you know, that kind of underscore that point, but that really kind of makes the point. So then for us as Orthodox Christians, we are liturgical because we understand, you know, our origins. We're sacramental, right? And I'll tell people before I close these remarks and take your questions, you know, that the Christian faith, the Orthodox Christian faith, is not about sin management. It's not a behavioral therapy. It's not intended to help you only avoid your passions. Nature abhors a vacuum. So too does the spiritual world. It is intended to train us to righteousness. Not just a negative aspect, okay, I don't want to sin today, but a positive aspect of I want to follow the will of God today. I want to act in a godly manner. I want to act in a God-pleasing manner. It's interesting, there's a series of songs and poems in Native American lore, and I've got a book called Walking Sacred. And it's kind of a prayer, a morning prayer of Native Americans. Today I am walking in a sacred way. I am walking in a sacred way today. And those days are different from other days. Those are days in which Native Americans understand that today is a day that is consecrated in such a way that I'm going to walk in a way that is collaborative and pleasing to God. So then how much more so for us? Not just to avoid sin. Big deal, we avoid sin, probably. But are we walking in a way that's pleasing to God? Are we sacralizing the world around us? Are we living Eucharistically, which we'd say Eucharistia, with gratitude, accepting everything as gift, even bad things? The beautiful prayer of St. Philip of Moscow, in unforeseen events, let me not forget that all cometh down from thee. So this then is the spine of the Orthodox life. We are a praying people. In tours of the cathedral, people ask me, what does it mean to be Orthodox? What are you going to pray? Comfortable shoes. We have lovely pews. You won't use them much. You stand in front of them. You'll be in church like a lot, not just Sundays. That's one of 7 days a week that we do prayer, right? And thank God here with Father and me and the helpers that we have, we do, all of our churches the same. We have prayer all the time. We have services all the time because the world needs us to pray for it. So I could go on and on. I don't intend to, but I want to give us a little bit of a context before we begin our questions, because then the topic must be, so then how then do we appropriate that? How do we participate that? And I had some of your questions. I don't remember all of them. There's some very good questions about obstacles and impediments to worship and how we do that as a married couple and things of that nature. Mary, maybe you have the exact questions, but I thought that you might want to reframe some of those after we kind of gave this a specific context to talk about our liturgical life, our Eucharistic life, our sacramental life. So if you want to give me some of those questions, I'll be happy to do what I can with them. Yes?
So
Alex.
could we design our own lives to mirror that of the liturgical life so that our own lives are in balance and like in a good rhythm?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing, is that, and that means we have real decisions to make. I mean, if we take on a line of work that keeps us out of church, it's probably a line of work we shouldn't take, to be blunt. We can't expect really to, I mean, if you look at the Eucharist as heavenly food, the bread of heaven, manna, right? Like if you don't eat food for a week, you'll be weak. If you don't eat food for a month, you'll probably die. Your soul is an organ of your createdness. If you don't feed it, there's going to be a price to pay for that. So, but to go deeper into your question, I mean, and this is one of the things our catechumens come to understand very early, is that we really do have to, in that sense, synchronize the rhythms of our life with the rhythm of the church, and the church prayer, and the church calendar, and the cycle of feast and fast. And then once you get a glimpse of that, and I got that very early as a catechumen, I was at a Vespers service, like, oh, wow, time doesn't seem random. Once you attenuate your life to the rhythm of the church, then you enter into a different word for time that we use in Greek, which is kairos, and not just chronos. Chronos, the father of Zeus, who ate his children, right? The idea being that chronos, time, always wins. It's a great consumer, right? But kairos is a different word, and the way that the church understands that term is a time of grace, a time of opportunity. So that's a good question. Yeah, we'll find life much easier if we do that. Get into rhythm with the church. Absolutely. Other questions?
One question. I printed out your love of the Bible. But one question was regarding doing the Jesus prayer during divine liturgy.
Yeah.
And if you do the Jesus prayer consistently, how do you participate with chanting as well?
I've never seen that as an either-or proposition, obviously. I know some hierarchs are not, one in particular I know isn't a fan of it. I think the idea though is to really is to immerse yourself really in the there's a beautiful book called The Church at Prayer by Emilianos of Simona Petra. And I would really highly recommend that you get that book, The Church at Prayer by Emilianos of Simenopetra Monastery in Monathos. And really just to immerse yourself in prayer. So, but to back up a little even before that, I mean, you know that there are entrance prayers and entrance psalms that are said before you come into church. So the priest does that. As we walk in, we take care of. Now, the way that I do it, I mean, and probably a lot of priests do, you know, my prayer rule on a Sunday morning is a little different because I'm going to replace some prayers with the prayers of the liturgy and things of that nature. But we come into church already praying. We don't wait till we get here to start praying. We come already praying, you know. And so you say, for instance, you're walking in, you know, the beautiful prayer before communion, how shall I, who am unworthy, enter the splendor of your saints, you know. And so you prepare yourself for prayer before you get here, you know, and that also means backing up a little bit. That Saturday night would not be the night to stay out late drinking or carousing, you know. Because again, the liturgical day for Sunday began at Vespers Saturday evening, right? Which is why the Saturday Vespers has all of the hymns for Sunday. So we really live then our lives in a way that really respects that appointment. So then we get here and we immerse ourselves in prayer, and the Jesus prayer, you know, is obviously a beautiful way of doing that. But be careful. We give you a caution. These are prayers we do all together, right? And so, this is just the issue of the human person. If we were ever even to do the Jesus prayer liturgy as a way of individuating ourselves from others, then you would not want to do that. You want to be there praying with everyone in the ecclesia.
Well, that's because like Orthodoxy is like the religion of unity. So like
All
you
that.
have the unity in the faith and
Yeah.
the unity in the prayer. If you're like separating yourself, then you're not doing it in the spirit of Christ,
Right.
but in the spirit of ego.
Absolutely. You know, I was in one of the versions of this talk that I was rehearsing in my morning walks was, you know, the Greek history of the English word from which we get idiot is one who would not participate in the public order, one who wants to remove himself, right? And so, and that's a challenge. We humans are very tricky that way. We can get ourselves, you know, in a tangle over even things that we hope to do in a good way. So, but that's a good question. Other questions? What's our experience of worship? Talk to me. How have we experienced worship? Do we find it? And every answer you give me is the correct one, so don't worry about that. But I mean, find it edifying, challenging, encouraging, discouraging. I mean, obviously, yes. You know. But I mean, what are our challenges that we face? One of the questions you gave me was, what are our obstacles? What are the roadblocks? What are the things that keep us from entering into the life of prayer in the church? And I'd be very curious to hear what those might be with you and what we could do maybe to help alleviate some of that. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions for having just your mind wandering during the service?
Distractions.
Perseverance. Turn this off.
Yeah, supposedly very taking all external measures, and it's just a matter of
So one of the things, and Father Thomas Hopko is very clear about this, that should be a part of our prayer rule every day is a period of contemplative silence. We live in a very noisy world. One of the things I learned, I had a serious car wreck in 2018, and I had a really bad concussion and had to get a lot of care for that. And one of the things that I learned, that if I am perceiving anything, my brain is working. So I had to go into kind of like you know, isolation chamber kind of a thing for 2 weeks after my wreck, just to keep my brain from working at all. Now some would say it never works anyway, but that aside, so to have a period of contemplative silence, and his recipe was not less than half an hour a day. Turn everything off. So come into church, don't turn on the radio, right? Don't take phone calls before church. Don't text before church. Leave all that alone, so that at least we're coming into the church fresh. Your mind will always wander. You'll never have a moment in church where your mind won't wander, but you have to constantly call yourself back. You know, which is why it's good sometimes the tactile experience of a prayer book and the prayers and, you know, kind of, yeah.
Be
It's
still.
always a challenge.
Be still and know that I am
Be
God.
still. We don't like being still. We're Americans. Other questions?
I think what kind of, well, adding on to that thought, what really helps me kind of stay focused in church and what goes on with not only looking at the icons and like everything like that, but the prayers, knowing what we're actually praying, who we're praying for, what we're saying to God, and joining in the
Yeah.
helps you stay focused a lot because you remember like you're not just there like standing around while everything's going on. You're participating. You're actively praying. So I think like if it was easier to know what was being said, it would be a lot easier to stay focused during the liturgy.
Yeah. I would say to read and to become familiar with the prayers of the various liturgies, St. John Christmas and Basil, you know, because that does comprise their Eucharistic canon, and reading them together, you know, one of the others is very helpful. Other questions you might have? Yeah, Dan.
I actually have a question. So this goes back to the participation element of this. At one point in time, did participation or lack thereof become an issue? Is this documented like anywhere by the church fathers where people just stopped participating and it became more like an audience member kind of thing as opposed to being a member of the congregation? This is like a strictly 20th
Depends on
century.
who you ask and their point of view. You know, I mean, there's no real sort of commentary on that issue. You know, but certainly from the scriptures it was assumed, and from the language of the church itself, with that sort of prefix "seen," you know, sigma, there is the idea that it should be something. The word itself connotes participation. You know, so I think, you know, and participation can happen on many levels, right? You know, I mean, noetically, spiritually, you know, internally, absolutely. You know, but I just think that we need to be careful. I was serving in Nuremberg with the priest there when I was visiting my daughter last time, and I was pre-apologizing in Greek to the priest, who's a wonderful man, and you remind me in Greek, it's not a show. It's not a show. And I think that sometimes that we can really get caught up in that. You know, we think that this is not a performance, it's not a show, right? It's prayer. And one of the challenges that we face, and I sort of nudge people about this, you know, is that it's also not magic. The liturgy isn't magic. Oh, you missed a word, so you got the incantation wrong, so the spell won't take. No. It's not magic. It's mystical. It's you know, again, we invoke the Vologemeni Vasili Patros. We're lifted up into the heavens. And so by liturgizing, we're simply elevating our souls, our hearts, our minds, really into the realm of ceaseless prayer in the heavens. So yeah, I think we need to be careful of that, because we can tend to, you know, magnify some minor aspect of the experience of worship to our detriment, and it's just being really that via logos, that dialogue between us and God. Other questions? Yeah.
How are we supposed to conduct ourselves after the dismissal of the divine liturgy? Like a lot of, you know, like a lot of times we'll have a coffee hour on Sundays.
Yeah.
Just how are we supposed to be like acting after that?
No, it's a good point. I mean, as a Christian family, like, I love our coffee hours here. It is so fun. I'm like a hugging machine. All these kids and these new people and people I haven't seen, and all these new families, like every week, you know, boy to God, new families, people coming in, you know, and just checking on people, and just that. One of the words we use to describe the church in the liturgy is kinotito, which is a place where koinonia exists. So that specific kind of, there's only koinonia when Christ is in the middle of it. You can't have koinonia on a secular level. Only in Christ can you have koinonia. And so one of the words we use is kinotito, and so I love coming together for coffee hour. I leave on such a just a high, really. But then to your question, we want to preserve the sacredness of that. So you know, it really is the Lord's Day. You know, I mean, and so we want to really preserve that. You know, and so that means that for the rest of the day, you know, we need to have a care about the things that we do. And not that you don't do anything. I mean, obviously, you know, but just understand, you know, to the idea of the rhythm of the church. We kind of live between, you know, the gratitude, the Eucharistia, of having partaken of the holy gifts, and then in anticipation of doing so again. So it becomes like a sine wave of our life. But to another point, and this is a point that Father Schneemann makes a lot, in the book For the Life of the World, right? That was just read. For the Life of the World. Right? Everything you do is for the life of the world. So even the censing rubrics, when the priest is doing the great censing and he turns around and faces down the center aisle, you'll sense the nave first, because what we do saves the world. If Orthodox Christians were not participating in the Eucharistic life of the Church, the world itself would be cast into darkness that cannot be envisioned. What we do matters to the world. Like a friend that's really a political guy. He's the only Orthodox guy I knew growing up. His grandfather built the church I was christened in. He became really political, and he wanted to try to recruit me. And I finally laughed and said, Ed, I'm just not recruitable. I said, you going to church? And he goes, no. Then you're just increasing the problem. You politicize until you turn blue and fall over. You won't do a thing. Going to church will. So I was like, well, okay. But he's a good friend. I can get away with it. But it's a good question, and we should have that consciousness, preserving that. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about going to different parishes on Sundays and whether that could be the hindrance to planting spiritual roots in one specific place.
Yes, it can be. Yeah, it's okay to visit. But we have to have relationships with a given parish. It's good to see you. God bless you. All right, blessings of the Lord. We'll see you again. Yeah, it's really it'd be an anomaly to do that consistently. You should have a relationship with your spiritual father, your father confessor. You identify with a given altar. And then if you want to go and visit for special occasions, things like that. But we want to always be careful of slipping into the problem of self-direction, right? Where we're not really accountable to a parish priest, and we think that we can kind of do it on our own. That's something we need to avoid.
My brother calls them gypsies.
Gypsies a little bit, yeah. Someone asked a question about how do you appropriate the Divine Liturgy as a married couple, and that was an excellent question. One of the things that Presbyterian and I did, even long before I was a priest, when our kids were little, is every Saturday evening after bath time and time in front of the icons, pray, we would each in turn say to each other, if I've done anything this week to hurt you or to offend you in any way, please forgive me. And Denise and I did it with each other, and then with each of the kids in turn, and they with us. And so particularly as a married couple, if you are accountable to the chalice, if you're accountable to the body and blood of Christ, then your marriage is going to be okay. Right? You can't, again, you're not supposed to let the sun go down on our wrath, and that is very good advice as a married couple. But particularly to know that you're going to approach the chalice together, you have to do so in a state of grace and love. And so, and particularly the raising of children. And Mary knows I can go on and on and on about the essentiality of having our kids literally being raised in church. But for married couples, it will be the source of strength in keeping your marriage on a sound footing. And if ever we get to the point that we're not, it's good to see you. God bless you, my friend. God be with you. All right. Then challenges will emerge. Other questions? I guess probably done. Stop.
You mentioned I was listening to a sermon you did. I guess it was a sermon that I listened to that was recorded on Ancient Faith like 10 years ago.
Yeah, I don't do that anymore.
And you mentioned
10 years is enough of it.
but you mentioned in that homily, it was very simple, but it impacted me a lot. The importance of getting to liturgy all the time, specifically to put the world out of your mind. And if you get there later, you can't put the world out of your mind. You said it a lot more articulate than I just repeated it, but that impacted a lot.
Coming into the church is like getting out of the rain. It's like getting out of a storm. We were talking about the sort of the American spiritual environment, a minute ago. I mean, all of our catechumens here, I didn't go find you, you found us. Right? You came here looking for something you couldn't get anywhere else. Right? So, yeah, if we're going to go have dinner with God, I'm not going to come late. And I'm going to go watch a ball game. I'll get there somewhere after the 7th inning stretch. No. You go to a movie, it starts at 7. I get there at 8:15. I can say that I was there, but I missed the whole thing. Right? I'm going to go on a date. Beautiful little girl, handsome guy at 7. I'm going to show up there about 7:45. It'll be okay. No. And we're going to do it. You go to work late every day? And so now, God himself invites us to come and eat with him and eat him, the bread of heaven. And I'm going to come late? I don't think so. I'm not going to be that, no. And not just from a sense of grim obligation and obeying a commandment, because I want to have more life in me. I want more of him in me. So I'm going to make every effort. Not just, Matin starts at 8:15. Right? Vespers, I mean, that's the boxed set of weekend services. Vespers, Matins, liturgy. Should you come to the second half of liturgy, you miss 2.5 services. And that's the point of attenuating our life to the rhythm of life in the church. Liturgical, sacramental, Eucharistic way. All right, any more questions or are we done?
Glory to you, our God.